All right, cool. Well, let's get started. Thank you all for joining Devon and myself today for SolarWinds' Tales from the Performance Monitoring Trenches. Come on, PowerPoint. Thank you. So a quick introduction about myself. So my name is Yun. I'm a principal solutions engineer with SentryOne/SolarWinds. But, I've been a DBA and developer for many years now. I've been in the trenches for quite a while. And really the rest of all of this kind of stuff is kind of fluff. So we're going to skip over that. Devon?
And I'm Devin Wilson, Senior Solutions Engineer with SolarWinds. Been around for about 4 years now. Big Astros fan. Gonna watch the Red Sox get their butts kicked tonight. And that's enough about me.
All right, so here's the thing. So Devin and I actually, we like to call ourselves SentryOne twinsies because we started working at SentryOne on the same day about, what, is it 4 years ago or 5 years just about now? So yeah, quite a long time ago. And, as solutions engineers, we spend a lot of time in customer environments, seeing all sorts of craziness, workloads that people are running and things like that. But very rarely do we run across problems that we can't actually help people solve using our software. So that being said, because we've been in these crazy environments, we have seen our fair share of craziness, and we've seen some things, as Devin loves to say, right? So, we may make faces like this on a fairly regular basis, if not daily. But, again, it's one of those, so this session is going to be all about kind of showing you how we can use SQL Sentry to kind of help you deal with some of those problems and things like that. We're going to be sharing a lot of different stories, and, I want to be very upfront. This is a vendor session. So, we're talking about product here, but I've sat through my fair share of really boring garbage vendor sessions. So we want to try and do something a little more fun here, share some fun stories, things that hopefully everyone can relate to, and then, kind of show you how SQL Sentry can solve some of those things for you all. So we have about another 30 minutes or so to hang out together. So with that, no more slides. This is all demo from here on in. So let me switch up my screens and then we can kind of get started. All right, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so the first thing I want to start off by is talking about something called advisory conditions within SQL Sentry. Most folks are used to getting alerts of, like a job fails, you have a deadlock, you have some long-running SQL, and sure, any decent monitoring product can, alert you about those different basic sort of things. But one of the cool things within SQL Sentry is that we can create custom alerts. We have an entire framework, which we call advisory conditions, where you can create an alert around any combination of performance counter evaluation, WMI query against data that we collect and store in the repository database, and or a T-SQL query. So given all of those things combined, you can do some very interesting things when it comes to alerting. So the first example I kind of want to show you guys is all about dealing with your best practices. So I'm going to zoom in here. So I have a advisory condition in here called cause social for parallelism changed. Okay, so you can see the definition of it down here. It's basically, driven by a query against sysconfigurations. Value does not equal last value. Hopefully you guys are spending some time tuning your SQL servers and changing cause social for parallelism based upon the workloads, right? So you may have different values across all of your different SQL servers. So you just want to make sure no one changes this on you. So an alert like this actually acts as kind of a tripwire for you. So it's, the reason I'm showing you this is to kind of get you thinking about some other different types of things that you can do as far as alerting. What else do you want to be notified of as opposed to just like a job failing, or the typical things that we think about. And then not only can we notify you via like this tripwire approach that something has changed, we can help you enforce your best practices and change it back. How do we do that? Well, when a condition is met, we have corresponding actions that get fired. And let me switch up to the server in question so that you can kind of see the example of that here. So what we're doing is on this particular server, I have a specific cause social for parallelism condition and action pairing set up here. And notice the action that's set up. Execute SQL. Everyone can send you an email. That's mundane, that's boring, but we can execute code on your behalf. So I don't know about you guys, but something I used to do is I had a DBA database on all of my servers. And one of the things I had in there was a copy of sys configurations as it was configured on that machine. So why not use an execute SQL action, reference that local DBA copy of sysconfigurations, and force everything back if this thing gets met? And that's essentially what I'm doing down here. It's referencing the DBA control sysconfigurations backup, and I have a bunch of code in here to essentially generate some dynamic SQL to force the value back. So this is a really cool example of being able to do something dynamically and actually, again, help you enforce best practices as opposed to just, warning you about stuff that's kind of blowing up in the middle of the night or what have you. So that's just one example of advisory conditions. Hey, Devin, do you happen to have any advisory conditions that you happen to like?
I actually do. So I like to start off when I'm working with a customer for the first time in their environment within the start page. So whenever I am getting somebody started off with a trial, I want to get them some quick wins. So the start page is a really great place to do that. I can see what your servers have been doing from the past 24 hours down to the past 15 minutes. And I'm looking for things that are going to give me some quick wins, like I said. So something that I see a lot, and I'm seeing it here in our demo environment across, what is that, 6 different servers, that high performance power plan isn't enabled. That can be an issue. You can just be cutting yourself off at the knees performance wise before you even get started with your workload. So that's definitely one that I keep an eye out on, but I do have one of them that gives me some pause. I have seen this in customer environments, and just an aside here, we can click critical and it's going to drill down on things that are critical in our environment here, and active corrupt pages can show up. So what that tells me is that you guys need some help with your maintenance plans. A vendor tool being installed on your machine being the first thing to alert you that you've got some active corrupt pages can be potentially problematic. So Andy, I know you have some more of these. What are some of your favorites?
So a different one that was actually coincidentally under the critical category is this one here. It's called Auto Dealership Demo SaaS Activity Log. So one thing that I used to have to deal with at a past company of mine is that, we were a SaaS application, a SaaS company, and we would store in this massive activity log everything our users were doing. And when users would start doing certain combinations of certain application actions in certain volume, it would actually cause the application to kind of fall on its face. This is a case where SQL Server is actually perfectly happy. So because I had that information, I created custom alerts using advisory conditions and wrote a bunch of T-SQL. And basically, it's just some brute force, count type code that basically looked at activity from the prior 30 minutes and the 30 minutes before then, and just did some simple trend analysis inside T-SQL. But this was a really cool way for me to get insight into what the application is doing. And instead of alerting the DBA, who doesn't really care about this, or me in this case, I alerted operations and folks on the app side of the fence. So that way they could do all the magic that they do with their load balancers and that sort of thing to help proactively prevent the application from falling on its face. And this was a huge time saver, and it really saved our bacon a number of different times over the years. And being able to do stuff like this can be very, very useful and compelling. One thing I like to tell folks is think about all the times you've had to write application-specific diagnostic queries of some sort, right? Like me looking into my activity log in the database. Maybe people are looking at inventory levels in a manufacturing system or other things like that. What are some cool ways that you can create diagnostics that are business-based to bring you business value? Because if you can bring business value through a operational tool like SQL Sentry, that's just a quick path to getting yourself another raise, because you can easily go to the CFO and say, hey, I just saved you a bunch of money on the business side because now we're doing some other cool stuff proactively. Give me more money. And who doesn't like more money, right? So that's just another fun example that I kind of like to share. So with that, Devin, I believe you have something else that you want to dive into next.
Yeah, there's something else that I've cooked up here, a very real world example. I was dealing with a very large auto manufacturer here in the US, and they were super concerned that every time they went into their CPU alerts over on the start page, that they were seeing all kinds of CPU alerts, but they knew they were really well provisioned. So the one that kept kind of coming up in our conversations was this high CPU for a single core. So the first thing I did was pop over to our performance analysis dashboard so I can take a look. So when it comes to our performance analysis dashboard, something that you might notice here is that we really separate out for you our SQL Server activity from your Windows OS activity. We do that very much on purpose. So the purpose here is to show you with this little tooltip that this VMSE WinServe1 SQL Server instance is taking up most of that CPU utilization. So you don't have to waste your time, maybe in the opposite case, of searching around in SQL Server if that's not really your issue. So what I wanted to do for them is dig into something like this, where they had low overall CPU utilization. So they were wondering where all these alerts were coming from. So right here, this line underneath the graph is where we have our high CPU for a single core. If I click anywhere on the screen, like I just did here, I'm going to get what's called sample mode availability, where I can click and I'm going to get 10-second granularity, where that's 27% utilization is going to get broken out for me by processor and by core. So here you can see, even though I have plenty of processing capacity available, only one core is being utilized. And that's exactly what we saw in their case. So if you guys take anything home today, maybe checking out those affinity masking settings, or perhaps even your maxed out settings might be something to go do. So I just wanted to take us back here to the history section. I know Andy and I both have tons of stories. We can talk to you all day, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Andy for his favorites.
Thank you for that. And real fast, I do see in the chat that someone mentioned that they're seeing a blank screen, but someone else also responded that that everything is okay. Could someone else please verify that the screen share is coming through with them? Just drop a quick note in the chat, please. Just want to make sure that we're not talking with a blank screen here. Okay, cool. Thank you for that confirmation. So yeah, I do apologize that someone else is having a screen difficulty at this time. All right, cool. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch gears to a slightly different server where I have a different workload example here. So we present to you a number of different performance counters from SQL Server, but the one that I like that's kind of a bit of low-hanging fruit is key lookups per second. Now, this perf counter in of itself doesn't always tell the entire story, right? But our dashboard is all about, kind of combining different things together, seeing different key things that are all happening at the same time. So what I'm going to do right here as a simple example is that I'm going to highlight this period of time, and then I'll zoom back in. So you see that, hey, during this big old spike of key lookups, we also at the same time had a big old spike in transactions per second. And that is kind of interesting. So, and there could be other different things that are going on, but this is an interesting case where, hey, if I happen to have a lot of key lookups, and sometimes key lookups are bad, but most of the time when I've seen this, it's actually one of those things of low-hanging fruit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pivot using the right-click jump to menu, and this is what's going to allow me to zero in on that period of time, but kind of remain focused around it. And I'm going to jump over to Top SQL. Inside Top SQL, we have a couple of different tabs of information, but the bit that I want to go over to is something called query stats, which is all about your high volume, fast running queries, right? I'm going to aggregate and summarize everything together so that you can very clearly see that we had this store procedure that ran 1,000 times each. The reason that there's two entries is that these are two different statements. One's an insert, one's a select statement out of this store procedure, the random VIN lookup. There was also this guy here, but I want to focus in on these other two. And in sum total across, the 10,000 or so executions, it did a ridiculous volume of IO behind the scenes. And this is one of those things that's kind of a hidden performance killer because, people have that fast running query, it runs, and you don't really think about it. But because your application and your users run it in ridiculous volume, it's one of those things that really adds up behind the scenes. So one of the cool things that I can do inside SQL Sentry in this panel is that I can drop down to this middle statements panel here. And the statement is going to show me everything that ran within the context of that batch. And then what I'm showing you over here is that we happen to have different summary columns that will show up dynamically depending on what has actually happened within these two given statements. And in this case, we obviously see that we have a couple of key lookup operations here. Hey, this thing has two key lookup operations. It was executed well over 10,000 times each. Aha, now I'm getting getting even closer to that particular culprit. Of course, I can scroll a little bit. Whoops, sorry with the zoom it. I can scroll a little bit further to the right, and I see the preview of the execution plans for this particular statement present over here. And look, I have 2 key lookup operations here. So let's take this a level further. I'm going to crack this open inside Plan Explorer, where I can take a closer look, but I'm specifically going to go to the Index Analysis tab. Let me switch up to the correct operation. Whoops, no, this is the one I wanted here. All right, I wanted to switch to this guy here. So I'm going to look at this key lookup operation and the, or I wanted the index seek off of the key lookup operation. Come on, there we go. Oh, yeah. So I'm moving windows around on accident. Well, this will have to do. I apologize about that. Yay for working with, tiny little screens and RDP sessions and stuff like that. What I'm trying to do is essentially show you the index analysis tab here. So I'm going to, focus in on this, index operation here, and then the subsequent key lookup that's going on over here. I can also do the same, so this is for the inventory table. I have another index seek and key lookup over here as well against the sales history table, but this example will do. When I scroll a little bit further up, you see that this is the index that was selected. This is what index analysis is showing us inside Plan Explorer. However, we have another non-clustered index here, and then there's a whole bunch of different pink columns and entries here. These correlate, and as I'm going to scroll slowly to the left, to the different columns that the query wanted, but they were not covering the non-clustered index did not cover things. So SQL Server in this example wound up using the clustered index. So is this a case where I can either create a new non-clustered index that better fully covers this query, or do I create or modify this existing non-clustered index to then better cover this query? So I can make some different changes around that. But this is a really cool way where sometimes, you may just find that, oh, it's just 2 or 3 extra columns that I just need to modify in order to make an adjustment to then get rid of that key lookup. And, again, it's one of those things where, hey, yeah, sure, this query may run really, really fast, but because it's running a bajillion times an hour, I can save a lot from a resource perspective just by making that adjustment to an existing non-clustered index. Maybe hopefully, this is kind of one of those low-hanging fruit kind of things. So that's kind of what I really wanted to show you all in the context of this particular example and demo. So let's take it back to the dashboard. And Devon, do you have any other stories that you want to share?
I actually do. So one of my very first proof of concept meetings that happened in person was a challenge, but in a fun way. So I'm going to take us back to the dashboard so I can get us started on what that conversation was like. So I walk into a room, if you can imagine, my very first big project, and the DBAs on staff said, hey, if you can settle this argument we're having with our VMware folks, we're going to buy your product. So right then I knew that this was going to be a really interesting engagement. So the first thing that they told us is, hey, we're just seeing a lot of latency on our SAP database. So you can kind of see that data down at database IO. We are looking at totals by default. You can get down into your top 10 files by highest latency first. But really, after looking at this, I thought we need to go to disk activity. So disk activity is where you can see live data like we just saw come through. That visualization, whenever you see red is a bad thing. It means that we've gone 30 milliseconds or more on our reads or 40 milliseconds or more on their writes. So when I was looking at their SAP database, yeah, I was seeing confirmed latency that they were able to correlate back to perfmon just to make sure that there were no glitches. So what you can do here is click on any of your data files, and then you'll get latency IOPS and throughput information over time. You can go back in time. This is just going to refresh for me while I'm on auto refresh. What we were able to do with that data was confirm that this has been a issue that has been there for a while and hasn't gone away. So the next step was to convince them to utilize our free VMware host monitoring. So once they did that, we were able to go ahead and open up their performance analysis there, head straight over to their disk activity tab, And this is where we really settled the score. So the vCenter reports that their engineers were looking at on the vCenter side were showing no detectable latency on the virtual machine where they hosted SAP. However, SQL Sentry is able to and does list out your individual virtual files here. So we were able to, just like you can see in this example right here, determine that we did have a virtual file that just wasn't healthy. So in that way, we were able to finally settle that argument, and we did end up winning that business. It's been a really good partnership since, but it's definitely been a story that I've liked to tell over and over again. It's important to look at more than just your SQL Server when you're looking for performance problems. So, with that, I know we're running a little bit short on time. Andy, it's all you.
Actually, we're generally doing okay on time because we're just kind of jamming through all of our different stories. So that's a good thing. So,
Right.
yep, no, we still easily got another 15 minutes or so to hang on until our dentist shows up, or we can just talk over our dentist because it's our dentist now. Anyway, so I do have another demo that I want to show you guys, and it is kind of related to disk utilization, but from a slightly different angle. So I am going to have to switch back to this particular server here, my Redmond SQL Redmond SQL 03, and I'm going to jump back to yesterday in the morning. So, of course, a good monitoring tool can, of course, help you go back in time to see what's going on, right? So let's see, do I have the correct time? Yes, I'm looking at a cheat sheet. So there's a lot of stuff here to memorize. We got a lot of different demos and stuff like that. Was this in the AM or the PM? Yeah, this is the AM. Okay, cool. And so in either case, so what we're looking at here is the database IO drop down over here. So what this is going to do is dynamically give you a list of the top 10 data and or transaction log files that experienced IO during this period of time. It may be all be fast IO because you could be running on really awesome Pure storage, right? Hopefully you are. But sometimes it's still interesting to look at this drop down to see which data files were getting hit the most, right? Or transaction log files. Or what we're seeing in this particular case was that, hey, maybe during this period of time, I expect most of the workload to be occurring against the auto dealership demo. But why is TempDB or TempDev in this particular case ranking as number one? Because I don't know about you guys, but I've been through plenty of experiences where I have unexpected TempDB utilization in the form of TempDB spills or other things like that. So again, you can use this as that quick little hint of, oh, hey, wait a minute, something could be going on. Maybe we're burning down TempDB or something like that. So a couple of different ways that you can kind of continue digging in on this. And let me take control back here, is that we're going to, let's see, we're going to, I got to use the sync button, and I'm going to jump back over to Top SQL. So I'm going to go over to completed queries this time to look for a specific example piece of code that should have executed during this period of time. And my example, of course, is not here because things like this happen during demos, right? Let's see. Oh, it should be 9:20 p.m., not a.m. So whoops, I goofed on that one. My apologies. There we go. This is the example piece of code that I'm looking for right here. So one of the pieces of information that we give you on the statement level is TempDB internal and TempDB user utilization. When they happen to equal, like in this particular example up here, this is representative of intentional TempDB utilization. Like, hey, I'm using temp tables and things of that nature. However, when we see them misaligned here, that tells me that, wait a minute, especially when internal is over user, that tells me that we had unintentional TempDB utilization, such as a spill or something like that. And in this particular example, when I go down to the preview of the plan diagram here, this is where we actually see some spooling, a different way that SQL Server makes use of TempDB. I like to think of it as essentially creating like a little worksheet on the side, or essentially it's creating a temp table internally is what it fundamentally boils down to. And then it's doing some work against that. This is fairly inefficient code, and this was specifically just written just to create a spool intentionally. But sometimes we have those situations where these things are happening unintentionally as well. So this is just an example of how you can kind of dig into that. And of course, you can crack this open inside Plan Explorer and dissect this a little bit further. In fact, if you're kind of seeing the the preview here, we're actually moving a large volume of data around from both of these different operators, and we have large volumes of data, and it's going into a nested loop join, which is a horrifically inefficient kind of methodology in this particular case. Again, this is intentionally bad T-SQL in order to kind of make this example work the way I needed it to work. But it's definitely an example of a piece of code that could be refactored very easily to, again, mitigate the bad anti-patterns that I put into here. So with that, I think we were going to switch gears here at this point, Devin, and I believe you were going to take us in a different direction next.
Yeah, so we've been telling a lot of customer stories today, but I have a bit of a personal story in regards to SQL Sentry and just how I think it could help in the field. I definitely, when I first came to the company, was kicking myself that I didn't have this particular feature because it just would have been so helpful in my day to day. And that is the event calendar. So I'm going to go ahead and right click right on the instance that I want to work with and choose event calendar. Then I'm going to choose the event calendar tab. So here is where you're essentially telling SQL Sentry the type of SQL Server activity you want to view on an Outlook-like calendar. So here I just have agent jobs because I think that really illustrates the power of this feature that I want to go over today. So when I was in charge of job schedules, you don't have a visualization oftentimes. It's looking at the job schedules and job activity within Management Studio, which is all I had at the time. Well, with SQL Sentry, we can come in and we can start to look at what failed in red. It's calling us right out in our face. I can see that I have an update measures and validate measures jobs here that look like they're failing pretty often. So what I'm also going to do here is back this up a little bit. I want us to see 4 hours of time, but I also want to show you what the future looks like a bit too here. So here we go. We're seeing that the update measures and validate measures jobs are failing. I can see why right in this window. I can also see job statistics. So what's the average runtime? What's the average, the min, the max? And how does this runtime stack up? And then I can also see orange colorations. So what these orange colorations mean to us is that you have two jobs that are running at the same time on the same machine. Now you can be perfectly provisioned for that. You could be looking at different objects and that's totally fine. So what I can do in that case is come in and just say that I don't want to treat this thing as a conflict. It's not causing me any problems. Then I can start moving on to my other jobs, so on and so forth, until I've made sure that I don't have any conflicts in my job schedule that are truly problematic. So I'm going to go ahead and change that back so I don't make my coworkers angry. Another thing that I really like to show here is what you can do when you find an issue. So let's say that I'm seeing this consistent pattern where I've got two jobs that are deadlocking against each other. I probably want to solve that pretty quickly. What I can do from here is look at a future run and then drag and drop that job to move that schedule forward and move it out of this constant deadlocking issue that I've got going on with the schedule. So it's going to ask me to make sure I'm sure I want to do that. But I'm going to cancel that for the purposes of this demo. And another thing that I had been known to do in the field, unfortunately, was to need to disable a job, but then sort of forgetting to turn that job back on Monday morning when I've worked over the weekend to fix whatever the issue was. But if you have SQL Sentry, you can disable your job until a future point in time in a way that last I checked, you can't do inside of Management Studio. So these are just some of the things that I think are very useful from an event calendar perspective. Another thing is just making sure that if you're spending a lot of time here filtering and sorting with your calendar, that you are creating calendars that are going to be useful over and over again and even to your coworkers. So one of my favorite ones, and I think Andy made this one, is backups, restores, and check DBs. So we can actually look at several different servers at the same time, not just one instance at a time. And this is going to help make sure that I'm visualizing my maintenance plans in a way that's meaningful and that everybody's looking at the same data. So speaking of these backups, restores, and check DBs, I know Andy has done a really cool job with another feature. So go for it, my friend.
All right, so that actually leads into something that's kind of an underrated feature that a lot of folks don't quite realize exists within SQL Server, and that's something called event chains. We're all about performance monitoring and letting you know when stuff is going sideways, but did you know that you can also use SQL Sentry as kind of a job scheduler for you? So I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of SSIS phobic. I'm not a fan of SSIS packages and having to do that type of thing. So what does the DBA do? Who's someone like me who doesn't want to deal with SSIS packages when they want to chain do things like chaining maintenance jobs together? Well, again, we can leverage SQL Center to do that with an event chain. So what I'm doing is I'm zooming in on a node. These are existing SQL Server agent jobs, and then I happen to have a backup job here that runs against London SQL 01, and then whenever that completes, then we kick off these two backup jobs simultaneously. So again, we're leveraging SQL Sentry as that job scheduler for us. So you see that as I'm kind of continuing along the workflow here, we're kicking off other jobs depending on when the parent jobs happen to complete. So this is a different cool way that instead of trying to time box your jobs, like maybe you only have 6 hours of maintenance time every night. So you got to make sure you cram in everything that you can, but you can't have certain things overlap one another, right? So you time box, like put in a 15-minute gap here and pray that the job doesn't run too long or happen to step over it. So instead, again, you can use things like event chaining where we control that. We are monitoring that. So when we see that when SQL 2 here completes, then it'll kick off those other jobs on those other servers. So this is the other cool thing is that, again, we can do things that are across multiple servers. I don't know about you guys, but this whole story was based upon when I had one job in the past where I only had 12 production SQL servers, but my SAN was kind of old and sad such that I could not actually run backups simultaneously from all 12 of those servers down to the SAN. It would actually crush the poor SAN in the middle of the night. So we had to stagger our jobs and had to do some creative things. And I wound up leveraging event chains to maximize my limited maintenance window in the middle of the night. And then, again, control jobs across multiple different servers. So it was a really cool kind of thing to kind of, again, it's one of those things that's underrated within SQL Sentry. A lot of people don't realize that it's there, but once you realize it, it's like, wow, what else can I chain together? ETL jobs and processing jobs, for example, other different types of maintenance. The options are pretty limitless because it's anything that can be stuck into a SQL Server agent job that we can kick off for you. And again, on whatever servers that you want to.
Mm-hmm. Yep, or Windows scheduled tasks even, which makes it even more flexible. So we don't want to take up all of your time today, but I did want to let you guys know, we know that we've gone through some nitty-gritty stories, some very specific information, but at the core of it, SQL Sentry is very, very helpful and very easy to use. So what we're looking for at the end of the day is the ability to just give you information, current information or historical information on the same dashboard where you can pick out where you've had any issues. You can see here that there's some resource consumption concerns without needing to know a whole lot about either SQL Server administration or Windows administration. I can just go ahead and right click on that workload, go over to Top SQL and start analyzing it so I can understand what parts of this workload caused that CPU spike that I just saw. And from there, I can have conversations with my developers, with my DBAs, sysadmins, and even my vendors on how best to solve these issues so that we have a highly performing SQL Server going forward. So with that, I just want to say thank you, Robert, for the mosaic of my puppy, and I will hand it back to Andy to wrap up.
All right. So with that, I will be switching back to the deck at this point in time. But, I do want to say thank you. I hope you guys have enjoyed this little bit of story time and a little bit of, again, something hopefully a little bit different from a vendor perspective. So we're going to open this up to Q&A right now. And I do see that we have 2 questions in the Q&A queue. If you happen to have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A queue or into the chat. The first question that we happen to have is, what is the major difference between DPA and SQL Sentry? So here's the thing. They both monitor SQL servers, of course, right? DPA does monitor other databases in addition to SQL Server. DPA takes a slightly different approach. What I like to think of as a bottom-up kind of approach because it's very not wait-centric, but response time-centric is kind of how I like to describe it. So, how long are your queries taking? And it's taking that query first kind of approach. We take what I like to call more of a holistic top-down approach. What's going on from that server level? Kind of like what Devon just re-summarized for us. It's like, we got to take a look at what's going on from that server level first, because everyone that's on that server is sharing those limited resources, right? So it may not be just queries that are causing your headaches. We showed you a couple of examples of where it's actually the IO subsystem that are causing you headaches, where it could be your virtualization layer that are causing your headaches, right? So again, so we take a fundamentally different approach. The one thing about SQL Sentry that we also appreciate is that SQL Sentry is very much a power tool when it comes to performance monitoring. We give you breadth and we give you depth. We give you all of the gory details that you may want about what's going on within your SQL servers. There's lots of different ways to drill down and navigate and get at that type of information.
Yeah,
So I hope, yeah, please,
Andy,
Devon.
there was one thing I did want to add to that. So what makes DPA super powerful is that it's not Microsoft specific. So we've designed SQL Sentry to be Microsoft specific in the way that we troubleshoot it. Now, wait times are universal. So that's what makes DPA really great when you're trying to troubleshoot other database platforms where you do have a mixed environment. So that makes us really good partners with SolarWinds, so you can really manage all of the databases that you might have in your environment rather than get stuck with different vendors when you're stuck in that situation. Also, there's another question here that I want to answer really quickly. How does SentryOne's OS monitoring features compare between Windows and Linux? This one's really easy. We do not give you OS metrics for Linux. You can still monitor your SQL Server portion when you host on Linux.
So that's a nice, fast, and easy one. So thank you for that. So are there any other questions that people may have about anything that we've covered, or anything else that y'all kind of want to dive into? And in the case that there's not any open questions, we got a couple more minutes until Argenis joins us for his particular presentation. So in lieu of that, I just want to say on behalf of Devon and I, thank you all for joining us and hanging out with us. One thing I actually always kind of like to ask for is just a little bit of feedback in the chat. If you thought that this session was at least entertaining and whatnot, just give me a quick +1 in the chat if you wouldn't mind, right? It's kind of how I've been, doing the equivalent of like audience applause or audience snoring, you know what I mean, in the chat. So again, hey, I know this is a vendor session, but if you found this at least amusing and entertaining, then yeah, I would appreciate just a little quick +1. And thank you guys for that. I appreciate that. Oh, there is a question. When will you fix that SQL Sentry does not work with Azure SQL Server in Elastic Pool? Well, essentially, Elastic Pool support is not there yet. It's on our roadmap. Everything is all about priorities,
Right. Yeah, we have to, when it comes to roadmap questions right now, what we have to do is send you over to the What We're Working On page on SolarWinds Slack channel. How can we use with ADS? I am not sure about that one. Andy,
well, Azure Data Studio is akin to, SQL Server Management Studio, right? You're using that as a development platform. With us, what you're going to be using our client for is not a replacement for your development environment, right? So, we're performance monitoring for you. We're keeping an eye on things. Now, there are certain things that you can do with Plan Explorer to use that as more of a performance tuning environment, but it's still not a true replacement for either of those. If you want to learn more about Plan Explorer, there's a ton of resources out there. And shameless plug, at a previous GroupBy, it might have been the last one or the one before, I actually did a presentation on an advanced Plan Explorer usage to help you drill into your execution plan performance issues and things like that. So go look that up on the GroupBy YouTube channel.